Hi everybody. Today's lesson is going to be dealing with public diplomacy in the age of terror. Basically, what we're going to be trying to do is to better understand political actors' ability in promoting their messages through the international news media. So our lesson today is actually following two of your readings. The first one is Bedtime Stories, the frames of terror promoted by political actors. And the second one is Promoting Stories about Terrorism to the International News Media. In general, the goal of those studies is to better understand political actors' ability or success in promoting their perceptions in the international news media. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why is that important? Why should we care how a conflict is being perceived in the international arena? So the whole notion of public diplomacy claims that since public opinion has such a huge impact on the creation of policies in foreign countries, especially democracies, political actors should invest considerable resources into the messages being promoted in the international news media. Now, looking at the article Bedtime Stories, what the concept of this study was to better understand the messages that different political actors are trying to promote through the media. So we were looking at messages promoted by the different political actors involved in the conflict, countries on one side and terror organization on the other side, and we found that all political actors are investing considerable resources into promoting their messages through the international media. And the messages are actually kind of similar. But to better understand the differences between the messages, we should look at the cultural differences between the political actors, their previous experience in dealing with conflicts, and the role the countries play in the international arena. Now, the paper promoting stories about terrorism in the international news media tried to better predict the amount of success each political actors will have in promoting its messages through the media. So we were looking at three different groups of variables, and you can better look at those variables in the paper itself. But generally, we were looking at the political culture proximity between the countries dealing with terrorism and the country where the media operates in, the target country's experience in coping with terror, understanding that societies that can better understand or relate to the experience of dealing with terrorism will empathize more with other countries that are suffering from similar situations, and the nature of the events occurring in the conflict. Just to give you a quick example, suicide attacks will promote more messages of the victimized countries, while military actions taken by the country will most likely promote more messages of the terror organizations. So today's presentation is gonna take a deeper look into some of those predicting variables while looking specifically at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The findings I'm going to show you now are actually from another study that I had conducted in the last few years. Basically, the goal of the study is to better predict the amount of success Israel on one side and the Palestinians on the other side would have in promoting their messages through the international news media. So basically, we were looking at three different groups of variables. The first group is dealing with the events occurring in the conflict, the number of casualties and the type of events. The second group is looking at the political context in which the media operates in. the leader's position. Let's say if a country's leader is supportive of one side of the conflict, it will be reflected in the media coverage. The target country's experience in dealing with conflicts or terrorism, similar to what you saw in promoting stories about terrorism. Again, we're looking at the political culture proximities between the country where the media operates in and the country that is involved in the conflict. And the last political context factor is the event's initiator. There's a logic claiming that the side that initiates the occurrences have more control over the messages that will be promoted. The third group of variables is actually the message context factors. And here we're looking at the gender of the speaker. There's a notion claiming that female speakers, women in general, have a way of promoting more messages, especially when we're dealing with conflict, since they're softer or perceived as more victimized. So that's another thing. So we're looking at different occurrences in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the last decade or so, starting with the capture of weapon ship in 2001, the disengagement from Gaza in 2005, Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, the Gaza flotilla raid in 2010, and the Gaza War of 2012, also known as Operation Pillar of Defense. So similar to what you saw in promoting stories about terrorism to the international media, here too we're looking at three different steps of the study in terms of the method. First of all, we were examining the messages promoted by the different political actors, Israel on one side and the Palestinian organization on the other side. On the second stage, we were looking at the frames that actually appears in the international coverage in three countries that are not directly involved in the conflict: the United States, the United Kingdom, and India. And lastly, we were looking at the circumstances that can help us better understand the success the different political actors had in promoting their messages. Similar to the paper promoting stories about terrorism to the international news media, in order to measure the amount of success various political actors have in promoting their preferred frames, we had developed the conflict coverage scale. The scale was constructed in accordance with Entman's approach. Media coverage is considered successful when the event, topic, or political actor is framed in a way that supports the positions that are favorable to one side of the conflict or detrimental to the other side. In such a case, the conflict coverage scale is gauged by measuring one side's degree of success in promoting its messages as opposed to the other side's success or failure. This variable is gauged by decreasing the number of messages promoted by the Palestinians from the number of messages that supports the Israeli sides of the conflict. When the scale is positive, the article supports the Israeli position, while a negative scale shows us that the article supports the Palestinian position in the coverage. Moving on to the findings, we will begin with the focal event factors or variables. And the first distinction is going to be between Palestinian actions and Israeli actions. So while looking at the Palestinian actions, we can see that while the terror organizations are using terror attacks, the messages promoted in the international news media tend to be more favorable of the Israeli messages or the messages Israel is trying to promote in comparison to other types of actions taken by the Palestinians. while looking at the Israeli actions, actually kind of similar. When Israel is taking a military action against the Palestinians, we can see that the coverage in the international media tends to be much more pro-Palestinians in comparison to other types of actions taken by Israel. Just a quick reminder, a negative score is a pro-Palestinian frame, and a positive score is a pro-Israeli messages being promoted in the articles. Still dealing with the focal event factors, we're moving on to talking about casualties. Now, the first bullet here deals with the Israeli casualties, but the events that were measured in that study did not have a large amount of Israeli casualties. We're talking about the disengagement, the Gaza flotilla, Operation Cast Lead or Pillar of Defense, which did not have a large amount of Israeli casualties. And we can see here that the correlation itself is too weak to reach any conclusions. But moving on to the Palestinian casualties correlation here, we can definitely see that when there's a larger amount of Palestinian casualties, there are more Palestinian messages that are being promoted in the international coverage of the conflict. Moving on to the context variables, the first one is the political culture proximity, and here we see that countries that are closer culturally to Israel tend to promote more pro-Israeli messages. As for the leader's position regarding the conflict, we also see a positive correlation here. It means that when the leader of a country where the media operates in supports one side of the conflict, the media in the same country tends to also exhibit the same support. So when the leader is expressing pro-Israeli position, the media will tend to be more pro-Israeli. When the leader is expressing more pro-Palestinian positions, the media itself will present similar pro-Palestinian messages in its coverage. Now, while dealing with the target country's experience in coping with terror, we can see that when a country is not dealing with terrorism, it tends to promote more pro-Palestinian messages in its coverage. As for the events initiator, we can see that when Israel initiates the events, the coverage tends to be much more pro-Israelis in comparison to events that are being promoted or initiated by the Palestinians or equally by both sides of the conflict. Now, looking at the message context variables, we can see a very interesting picture here that more female speakers, female Israeli speakers, tends to promote more Israeli messages in the international news coverage, and more Palestinian female speakers tends to promote more Palestinian messages in the international coverage. Now, this regression model is actually taking all the different variables, all the different predictors into consideration while measuring the coverage or the amount of success each side have in promoting its messages. I won't go into too many details, but we can see that most of the predictors are still the correlations still work even when taking into consideration other factors. And the most influential predictors are the events occurring in the conflict. We can see that the more influential predictors are the casualties and the events occurring in the conflict. So reaching our conclusions, this distinction between the influence of context and focal event factors is important because it may provide us insight into how journalists construct news about conflicts. When covering conflicts, the media places greater emphasis on the events themselves than the context where the media operates in. The events actually narrow down the range of frames the journalist can use while reporting about the occurrences. The findings show us that when the events are compatible to a political actor's narrative, the media coverage presents more messages that support that actor. Intensive and violent terror events promote more messages of Israel, while a military action by Israel is actually promoting more messages of the Palestinian side. The findings suggest that even though the media usually use familiar frames and the reporting is being done with a specific narrative, the events play the most significant role in determining how the media will cover the occurrences. In today's reality, when there's an image battle going on alongside the actual confrontation or military confrontation, a deeper understanding of the circumstances that allow political actors to better promote their messages through the media can help public diplomacy professionals to better prepare themselves to dealing in this image war, which is a very important aspect of today's conflicts. Thank you.